Welcome to the program today. My name is Mondo Gonzales, and I'm here, with Skype with Bill Salus all the way from Western United States. So welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Mondo. It's great to be back on the program.
You know, it is always good to have you because there's no doubt a lot is going on this last week, and I thought it'd be good to reach out and talk to you because, you know, we're seeing on Facebook, we're seeing other things, and where people are saying, hey, this is nothing new. This is just typical saber-rattling with Israel going back and forth. And, you know, even if that is true, it's still our job to watch and to make note and to share and to teach and to highlight. I mean, there's no doubt one of these times, as we continue to go, it's going to come to that point. And one of the things that I want to talk about today is why today is different than the past, and why this isn't just typical saber rattling. You know, any initial thoughts?
Well, as we're going to go through some headlines and some history of this JCPOA, which Iran is now, they're in the 7th round of talks in Vienna to try and put back together that JCPOA treaty. And the headlines that are going on, the military drills that have been going on, the budgets Israel's been passing, the tenseness in the Persian Gulf has increased dramatically. I think we have to look at this very seriously as to there will be a war, probably an attack from Israel on Iran, and that could have prophetic implications. And I think in this program we should try to kind of cover all those bases, dot those I's, and cross those T's.
You know, if you will, give us kind of the review of, for those that might not know, the the JCPOA document, where it began and where it has been, where it's been stalled since we've had a change of U.S. administration. Kind of give a summary of that, if you will.
Sure. I'm going to give some dates because I think it's important to follow the chronology of the events. This will just be some summaries of the highlights. In January 30th of 2012, it begins back when Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta at that time said Iran is just 1 year away from producing a nuclear weapon. And in April of that year, April 2012, that's when the JCPOA talks began between Iran and the P5+1. The P5+1 are Russia, China, France, UK, USA, and the +1 is Germany. And those are all the countries that are in the non-nuclear proliferation treaty, and they were allowed to have nuclear weapons. Iran is in the treaty as well. The Shah got them involved. I believe that was in 1970. So they were allowed to have nuclear energy, but they're not allowed to have a nuclear weapon, and no one trusts Iran. So that's, of course, why you have this need for this treaty to make sure they don't get a nuclear weapon. Well, after 3 years of negotiating, in July of 2015, the JCPOA got ratified and came into effect. Then in January of 2016, President Obama signed an executive order revoking all the sanctions that had been on Iran. So Iran, and roughly around that time, it was said that Obama gave $150 billion in funds to Iran. The Democrats don't say that didn't happen. The Republicans say that did happen. So you try to find out, did it really happen? You go on Google, you'll find out there's mixed views on that. But apparently he sent $150 billion to Iran, which went to advancing their ICBM intercontinental ballistic missiles, feeding fuel and weapons to their proxies, Hezbollah, Syria, the Houthis in Yemen, Assad is a proxy in Syria, and Shiite militias in Iraq now. So these are proxies of Iran. Also the Hamas. So those monies were put to those types of uses in large part. And then in May of 2018, Trump fulfills one of his campaign promises, which was to back the U.S. out of that JCPOA, and he did that in May of 2018. And then by November 5th of 2018, he reintroduced very stiff sanctions on Iran, and that's one of the big deals with Iran right now. That's what they're trying to negotiate, is removal of these sanctions. Then in November of 2020, the BBC announced that Iran has more than 12 times the amount of enriched uranium permitted by the JCPOA. So once Trump got out, Iran started to breach that JCPOA, even though the other 5 members, apart from the USA, were still involved in that treaty, right? But Iran has used it as a green light to advance their program. And in March of 2021, China, one of the JCPOA members, agreed to invest $400 billion in Iran over 25 years in exchange for a steady supply of oil to come to their economy. So now, we're not dealing with a level deck at this point in time. Russia's also involved with Iran. They're part of the JCPOA in building nuclear facilities. They're going to build Bushehr 2 and Bushehr 3. They helped build Bushehr 1, and that's Bushehr is the region of probably in a prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49 of ancient Elam. So we're watching that. Well, there's nuclear reactors over there. And then in June of 2021, recently, past June, Iran announced it's at 60% enrichment. It's the highest level of uranium enrichment Iran's ever achieved. And it's just a short technical step from their Mondo to get a weapons-grade nuclear weapon at 90%. Just a technical step to get from 60 to 90. And then December of just a couple days ago, in the midst of the Vienna talks that are going on right now between Iran again, the 7th round of talks, Iran starts enriching uranium up to 20% with advanced centrifuges at the Fordow plant during the nuclear talks, which is a major breach of the JCPOA. So that's the history. And now the Vienna talks are going on. There have been 6 rounds between April and June of this past year, of this current year. They took a major break for the elections in Iran where Ebrahim Raisi was elected president. And now they're going to resume talks. The 7th round of talks are taking place right now. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, said just yesterday that he is not optimistic that these talks will result in a nuclear deal. But if you talk to Vladimir Putin's group, the Russian delegation, they're positive. They think something's going to come out of this. Iran is, in the first 6 rounds of talks, what Iran did was they told what sanctions they wanted removed, and pretty much they want all the sanctions removed. Then nothing was agreed on them rolling back their nuclear program back to the JCPOA limits. And now in the 7th round, that's the same thing. They're just really trying to get their sanctions removed, and they might freeze their developments on the nuclear program, but I don't see any chance that they're going to roll them back to the 2015 limits but introduced because of the reasons I've just shared. They're 12 times the amount they're allowed. They're up to 60% enrichment. They were never supposed to go that high. So it's really Israel's taking large steps now. Like, I want you to talk about that budget, and we'll talk about that. They just passed specifically to attack Iran. So this is really heating up, Mondo.
Yeah, I mean, that's important that you brought that up because, the beginning of last month, for the first time in several years, the Israeli government under Naftali Bennett, they passed a budget. It was one of the first times he got credit. It was a great job, all the political machinations to get it to happen. But one of the interesting things that was included in that budget was $1.5 billion for the explicit preparation of a preemptive or just a full-scale war against Iran in order to minimize their nuclear ambitions, if you want to say it that way. But this is interesting because now the money was approved, so the money is there, and of course, as we're watching, Israel has been doing several layers of exercises and other military things. Planes are flying low. We're getting reports of that, of them coming in super fast, super low jets in anticipation of a possible attack. So the money's there now. This isn't just pie in the sky, but I want to ask you another question before we move on, because we have the budget, so that's helping us to understand that this current situation it's at another layer. But you mentioned that the JCPOA began back in 2012, because at that time, there was the warning of, hey, Iran could have a nuclear weapon within 1 year, or the enrichment. Okay, well, here we are, 8, 9 years later. See, we're just hype, it's sensationalism. Why is that not true? What's the difference? What happened after 2012? Because it's certainly been 8 years. What happened to prevent the enrichment of the weapon? Because I thought they were going to have it in a year. How do we respond to that?
Well, they scaled back because of the JCPOA. They were only allowed certain limits of production that would have been useful for civilian energy purposes and things like that. And they had some inspections that were generally pretty good with the IAEA as part of that JCPOA. But when Trump backed out, those inspections have been getting fewer, and now they're not even getting access. And the IAEA just came out and said, that they're producing 20% enrichment in Bordeaux, which was the headline I just told you. So, and they've done the 12 times the limit. They've got 60% uranium. I mean, they are literally, there's some estimates they could be just several weeks away or a month from having a nuclear weapon. Some of the conservative estimates are still a year out. But, you can't trust Iran. And if you're not inspecting the facilities, and they're boldly coming out and saying we're doing 60% enrichment. So, it's like they're not hiding this at this point. They may be hiding if they've got a nuclear weapon, and they certainly probably will do that when they have one, if they don't already have one. But the interesting thing about that budget, that $1.5 billion, which is 5 billion shekels equivalent, is, like you said, it's directly to attack for Iran, an Israeli attack upon Iran. That's pretty unprecedented as far as I've ever heard in Israel's history. And maybe they've passed budgets like that before, so I'm not saying that I know that. But it's interesting, that was on October 19th. On October 25th, Iran responded. One of the Iranian military leaders named Shamkhani, he wrote on Twitter, he said, instead of allocating $1.5 billion budget for atrocities against Iran, the Zionist regime should focus on providing tens of thousands of billions of dollars to repair the damage that is going to be caused by Iran's shocking response. Mm-hmm. See, they're defiant, and they think they can take out Israel with their proxies. Hezbollah's got about 150,000 missiles to the north. Some of those are precision guided. They've got a bank of targets that they can hit with pinpoint accuracy. Syria's got chemical weapons, and Bashar al-Assad will go to bat with Iran as well, and Hamas and the Gaza. The Houthis might even get involved down in Yemen. The Shia militias in Iraq, they're close by too. They can all these, and then Iran's missiles themselves coming at Israel. That's what Israel's looking at, and Israel's aware of that. But they understand that they still have to take out Iran's nuclear program, because the nuclear weapon, in the mix of all these other things we just talked about, Hezbollah and all that, it's a game changer. It's an existential threat for Israel. So they've been saying we're going to take out Iran's nuclear program. They're not allowed to have a nuclear weapon. We'll never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But they're going to put up the force to prevent that from happening, because Iran is racing towards nuclear breakout threshold.
Let's go back for a moment, because when we think about the idea of back to 2012, they're a year away. Well, what people often forget is the reason that deadline continues to be extended is because Israel has done several behind-the-scene computer hacks and other sabotage elements in Iran. They just last year, I think it was last year or the year before, remember they a covert operation where they went in and they actually were able to retrieve the data and from one of the servers in Iran, and Netanyahu went on public television highlighting all the things that the covert people had stolen. And so Israel has kept pushing this deadline back and back through their operations, and they're coming to a point now where, because of the reaction of Iran, they're putting their stuff in more in-depth bunkers. They're becoming more and more out of reach of Israel's, covert attacks or their sabotage. And so it's kind of coming to a point of no return, where now they have to think in terms of full-blown military Air Force attacks rather than behind-the-scenes subtle, cyber attacks and other things. So as you mentioned, the game has changed. That's why this is different.
Yeah, they're not putting any faith in the JCPOA being reinstated. They've lost a lot of faith with respects to, they felt that Donald Trump had their back. At least America would come alongside, maybe even attack Iran with them. That's not necessarily the way they feel right now in light of the Biden administration. They're not really sure if they're going to have that same kind of support. And I think they're right in thinking that way, because we saw what happened with the Afghanistan debacle. You and I did a program on that. Russia's getting ready to take over Ukraine. China's getting ready to take over Taiwan. So big events are coming in 2022. And I think some of those might lead to prophecies, especially Iran. A nuclear disaster in Iran is predicted by Jeremiah about 2,600 years ago in Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 34 through 39. We can do a summary of that prophecy before the show closes. But I think that's going to lead to prophecies building upon prophecies, that we may be living at the threshold right now on the timeline of the next biblical prophecy finding fulfillment. It's been 70 plus years since 1948, Israel was rebirthed. Of course, 1967, Jerusalem was taken over in the Six-Day War. But we're approaching right now where the other biblical prophecies are really stage setting and about to happen. And I know most of our colleagues would say, well, look out for Ezekiel 38, look out for Ezekiel 38. Iran's involved. But Iran's also the subject of another prophecy that I believe happens before that, in that Jeremiah Elam prophecy.
Let's kind of give another summary, because here we are, right before the talks began this week. The Iranian brigadier general, he goes on record. I mean, this is kind of throwing out a bomb before the talks even begin, saying, hey, look, we are committed to the destruction of Israel. We have not shied away from that for even 1 millimeter. And therefore, just so you're aware, nothing's changing. And so with that, let's talk for a moment. Let's kind of set the groundwork. Similar to the Palestinians, and what I mean by that is in the Palestinian charter, they have said very clearly, that they want to push Israel to the sea. There's no two-state solution in the Palestinian charter. They have this theology or this ideology. Let's talk for a moment about the Islamic theology of Iran, and we saw that with Ahmadinejad, the previous, president a couple times ago. How does that mindset shape really the whole situation?
I think that's a good point you're bringing that up, Mondo, because when Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran, guys like Joe Rosenberg was at the forefront of this, and he was right to do this, was talking about the Islamic theology that they have, and Ahmadinejad, which means if they don't care if there's an apocalyptic condition. Matter of fact, we can create an apocalyptic condition in the Middle East because it's going to hasten the coming of our Islamic Mahdi, the Mahdi. So Ahmadinejad actually felt he was called to office at that point in time for that purpose. Now, of course, like you said, there's been Rouhani since that, and now they got Raisi and stuff. But that Islamic theology did not go away. Iran's goal is, and that's what they've been doing for the last couple of decades, ever since the revolution in 1979, when the Shah was deposed. They've been wanting to establish a Shiite-driven Islamic caliphate in the Middle East, in the Fertile Crescent, but also over the world. And so that's why they've got their proxies and their tentacles spread out throughout the Middle East. And if they get a nuclear weapon, it shifts the entire balance of power, and it will pretty much ensure their ability to forcefully instate a Islamic caliphate. So if they get into a war with Israel, and they actually think they'll win with all their proxies and stuff like that, and I think Israel takes a severe hit when that happens, and I think that will happen, maybe even in 2022, and it'll be prophetic. We can get into that. But the apocalyptic condition created would actually be, okay, here comes our Islamic Mahdi. They would be thinking that's a possibility. So I think we need to keep that in mind at this point. That never went away from the time of Ahmadinejad. That is still their Islamic theology.
So here, when we have what's going on in Vienna, one of the best sites I like is going to debka.com, because they have good intelligence. And they were discussing in an article just yesterday, talking about that three things: that Iran has officially abandoned the ambiguity related to the idea of their nuclear program being solely for energy, that they have admitted that it has an offensive purpose to it. And so they become very brazen now, because they see truly we could say that the United States and Israel, the two governments, is really one of the weakest times, certainly since Obama, and maybe could be even weaker than that in the sense of their relations. This current administration seems to be going definitely behind the scenes, subverting so many things. They just blacklisted a couple cyber companies recently, just out of the blue. I mean, there's been a lot going on. Even recently, Israel had to hear this secondhand, but that they have adopted a policy of less for less. Less sanctions for less, refining of the uranium. But Israel's like, well, where did we get that from? And so you have the subtleties of the current administration going behind the scenes, undercutting Israel, really in the eyes of the world. And of course, as you mentioned it, Russia and China, they truly don't care. They're looking at it from an economic, financial perspective.
Right. So Iran's got them in their back pocket, essentially. So these Vienna talks are a farce. Iran is just going to try to leverage their way to get the sanctions removed, and maybe as a compromise, they might freeze what they're doing for a while. But remember, going back to the JCPOA in 2015 would require them to roll back all the advances they've done. And even that deal had a sunset clause where after 2031, Iran had no more prohibitions on what they could do on their nuclear program. So it was not even a good deal in the first place. It didn't, and it certainly didn't address the intercontinental ballistic missile issues, which are rapidly advancing. Iran has missiles that could actually hit Israel in 8 minutes. And so what we're talking about right now is a very active situation, an epic, probably biblical war that's forthcoming. This is even preceding probably Psalm 83 and Ezekiel 38. That we could be looking at right now, coming at us like a freight train and affecting the world, or be globally impacting, because still you got quite a bit of oil going through the Persian Gulf there, from the Gulf cooperative states over there that surround the Arab states. So, I mean, we've been writing about this stuff. We've been doing shows about this stuff for a long time. This, to me, is very different right now. This is very serious. We knew at some point it had to come to this, and I think we've come to this point right now.
Yeah, so again, let's summarize for those that are watching. Again, for those that might be like, hey, this is just typical rumors, wars, and rumors of wars. Why is it that right now, here we are today in early parts of December, why is this different than the saber-rattling of the past? What's changed?
Well, Iran's got themselves at a nuclear threshold right now. They could be just weeks away from having a nuclear weapon. And, they could have, even by the midterms of next year, if they get one nuclear weapon, they could have 2, 3, or 4. And Israel says, we're not going to allow that to happen. And they're actually passing budgets, $1.5 billion for a military strike in Iran. That was in October 19th. They're getting very serious about this. They've been doing military drills, advanced military drills recently, where they were concerned about this very thing we're talking about, a proxy war with Iran also involved, coming against them, especially in the north. They were evacuating cities, and in the event that they had chemical weapons coming in from Syria, which they're concerned about that. These drills took this all into consideration. Amphibious drills they did recently down in the southern part of Israel, preparing to attack also from the sea. And it's interesting that Jeremiah 49, 23 through 27, with a different camera angle on the Isaiah 17 destruction of Damascus prophecy, says there's trouble on the sea, it cannot be quiet. And Syria grows weak, like a woman in labor, and fear seized by fear. Israel has submarines out in the Mediterranean Sea with nuclear weapons on them, German-made diesel submarines. So this stuff, Mondo, it seems to be, we're watching it in the news. They're doing drills that actually could lead to stuff that's been written 2,500 plus years ago in biblical prophecies.
Yeah, we see that Naftali back, he was speaking in front of the UN in September, and he said very clearly, hey, we're willing to do it alone. And he was continually warning about the upcoming Vienna talks and how, they weren't going to back down. Just recently, in the past week, the Mossad chief went out and he publicly said, I pledge that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. And so you have these very stark and strong words coming out of this new, really, Israeli administration. If you will, let's prophetically speaking, with all of the different scriptures, Ezekiel 38, a lot of people are wondering about that, Jeremiah 49, Isaiah 17, Psalm 83. I mean, you're the perfect guy to bring a scenario. Let's talk about the potential chronological scenario based on what we have in Scripture, based on where we're at right now at this very moment with Israel potentially going out on its own to striking some of that. How would you envision? I know it's fiction here, or it's at least truth fiction in that sense, or it's a scenario, a conjecture. Help us understand a possible scenario of what that would look like.
Okay, and I'll preface it by saying there's a famous old, I think it's a Chinese saying, says, he who lives by the crystal ball walks on a lot of broken glass. Okay, well, we're not living by a crystal ball. We're living by biblical prophecy. We understand it's accurate, and it's a third of the Bible. And we're looking at stuff right now that has been predicted, I think, for our time, this particular hour of the days we live in. So what I'm going to say is Bill's scenario on how things are going to lie out.
As of today.
Yeah, and the sequence of events prophetically that I believe, that I'm watching for, It doesn't mean I'm right. I've got a lot of critics who would disagree with me on this, but you've asked the question,
I
I'm going to
did.
lay it out. Okay. I think what's going to happen is Israel, probably alone, but it could be with other allies. They could form a little coalition because, Saudi Arabia doesn't want to deal with Iran's nuclear weapon. America has vowed that, Iran won't get a nuclear weapon. But I think Israel's probably going to go alone, and they're going to strike Iran. They're going to strike them decisively. But Iran is not going to roll over and play rope-a-dope. They're going to come right back at Israel. They're going to call Hezbollah to come right at them, Syria to send chemical weapons in, Hamas. Hamas could send 1,000 missiles from the Gaza day. Hezbollah could send 1,000 or more missiles to the north. Remember, in 2006, there was a 34-day war between Hezbollah and Israel, and Hezbollah lobbed 4,000 missiles over 34 days and kept a lot of Israelis in bomb shelters up in Haifa and stuff for that 30-day period. This is not the same Iran. They've got more advanced precision-guided weapons, missiles. They got 150,000 roughly missiles are the estimates. I think what's going to happen is when that starts to happen, Israel's going to strike the Elam area, which the Elam area is, and this is a prophecy in Jeremiah chapter 49. We talked about verses 34 through 39. Elam has, that's the west coast of Iran. Ancient Elam, when you look at a map of Iran, Persia's mainly Iran, but on the west coast, hugging the Persian Gulf, where the Bushehr region is, where the Bushehr nuclear plants are, that's subject of the prophecy. And it's a nuclear disaster. God is fiercely angry, it says, and he brings about a disaster. We've talked about the prophecy before. I don't necessarily want to get into the whole details of it, but it becomes a nuclear disaster. The reason we think it's a nuclear disaster is because after it gets struck, the disaster happens, all of the indigenous population has to flee for refuge. It says there'll be no nations where the outcasts of Elam don't go. So it seems to be a humanitarian crisis is sparked. Now, Bushehr nuclear reactor is not necessarily the main target of Israel, because that's not necessarily, they're interested in Fordo and some of the other targets that are clearly enriching uranium for a nuclear weapon. But that area is where the closest area to Israel, where Iran could launch missiles, underground missile silos, portable missile launchers. And I think Israel is going to have to take out that area as this war escalates. And that's going to create Israel getting hit real hard. In Isaiah 17, they're going to destroy Damascus. Isaiah 17:1, they'll destroy Damascus. But that prophecy also says that when they do that, they take a serious hit. It says that in that day, and the viewers who are familiar with Isaiah 17, they need to really acquaint themselves with Isaiah 17 verses 4 through 6. It says, in that day that Damascus is destroyed, and we're told in verse 9 it's destroyed by Israel. The desolation is caused by the children of Israel, Isaiah 17:9. It says, the glory of Jacob will fade. This is not a good picture for Israel. Its fatness in its flesh will become lean, talking about Israel. It'll be like a shaking of an olive tree with 2 or 3 olives in the topmost bough, 4 olives left on the fruitful branches. The imagery that Isaiah points is Israel's taking a hit. An olive tree can have up to 500,000 olives. They're a very common tree in the Middle East and Israel. You picture an olive tree on the image of it, on a map of Israel, and it shakes, and you got 2 or 3 olives left in the uppermost branch, meaning northern Israel. What happened to the 500,000 olives, right? 4 or 5 in the fruitful bough. So I think what happens is northern Israel, maybe even down through Tel Aviv, they take a serious hit. They probably have chemical weapons coming in. It's a prison rules fight. They have to take out Damascus. When they take out Damascus, the other Arab countries are going, wow, they just took out an Arab city. What's to stop them from taking out Beirut, Amman, Jordan, Mecca, that sort of thing. And Israel's hurt right now. We need to go after them. And I think that's when you'd have Psalm 83, because those countries are involved in that. And those are legitimate concerns, because we find out in Jeremiah 49 verses 1 through 6 and Zephaniah 2, 8 and 9, verse 8 and 9, that Amman, Jordan actually gets desolated. It becomes a desolate mound. It says there's an alarm of war, and Amman of the Ammonites, which is Amman, Jordan. And it becomes a desolate mound. It says Israel will take possession of its inheritance. Remember, that's part of the promised land all the way into Jordan and beyond into the river Euphrates. So I'm thinking we got Jeremiah 49, the Elam prophecy. That leads to Isaiah 17:1, the destruction of Damascus. That leads to the Arab countries coming against Israel in the final war, complete Psalm 83. And then I think when Israel's won that war, they'll win that war, but they'll take a beating in the process. That's when Russia puts together its predominantly Muslim coalition of Ezekiel 38 and 39, including Iran. Iran doesn't get totally destroyed, but I believe they get compromised as a result of the Elam prophecy. And I think they're going to come down against Israel in Ezekiel 38 and 39 for plunder and booty. That Israel at that time will be dwelling securely, without walls, bars, nor gates, in receipt of great plunder and booty. And that's what Russia's coming after. So it's in a different motive than Psalm 83, which is to take the promised land for themselves, the pastures of God, to have a Palestinian state, that sort of thing. So that's what I'm looking for. We've got books and DVDs on all this stuff through Prophecy Watchers about Psalm 83 and about the nuclear showdown in Iran, in case the viewers want to become more acquainted with these prophecies.
It's interesting when here we are, we're watching all this as Jesus told us to do in Mark 13:37, be watching, which should lead us all to be ready. And so we're not here to sensationalize things or to exaggerate or embellish by any means, but this particular iteration is different because the line is being drawn, and we see I think based on the failure of the Vienna talks and even of the other agreements, that timeline is becoming closer and closer where, again, Israel can't do it behind the scenes anymore. The only way to truly push it completely out of the way is through direct military, attack. It reminds me of the book of Revelation in the sense of, where John is given the scroll to eat, and it's bittersweet. So here we are, we're watching this stuff, and there's an excitement about knowing that Scripture's being fulfilled, which is a great testimony to God's majesty. But on the other hand, it's still bitter. It's bitter to watch war and carnage and to see these very terrible things, coming to pass.
Right. Well, when diplomacy fails, wars begin. The two-state solution has failed. It's not going to work. It's going to come to war for Israel to survive and make itself, ensure its existence. The Israeli Defense Forces exist in fulfillment of biblical prophecy for pre-tribulation events, because Israel is not at war in the tribulation. In the first half of the tribulation, they're at peace. They got a pseudo-peace because of the false covenant they've signed. They think they're okay, they're at peace. In the second half, they're fleeing for their lives because the Antichrist is committing a campaign of genocide. And in Zechariah 13:8, we're told 2/3 of the Jews in the land will be cut off. 1/3 will come through the fire. That becomes the faithful Jewish remnant. But I'll give you just a couple quick quotes for your viewers. Ezekiel 37:10, Israel become an exceedingly great army. Obadiah 1, verse 18, the house of Jacob will be a fire, the house of Joseph a flame. Read that as the Israeli Defense Forces. But Esau, read that as the Palestinians, will become stubble, and no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau. Ezekiel 25:14, I will execute my vengeance on Edom. Read that as the Palestinians. By the hand of my people Israel, they shall execute my vengeance, my fury. That's the Israeli Defense Forces. Zechariah 12 talks about verses 4-6. Those nations round about Israel. The house of Judah will be like, the battlefield will be like a fire pan and a fire in the wood pile. The governors of Israel, read that as the captains of Israel, shall be like a fiery torch, and the surrounding Arab nations shall be like sheaves, and Israel shall devour the surrounding nations, and Jerusalem will stay in this place. These are just 4 or 5 of the prophecies that have to happen before the tribulation that have not happened yet. And so it's going to come to the point where they find fulfillment. And, this rhetoric back and forth of saber-rattling, it's no longer going to work for Israel. They've got their back against the wall, their back to the sea, and they've got to launch out. And they will prevail. But I do believe they're going to take a hit in Isaiah 17:4-6.
Benny Gantz just last week here, this week, he was talking about really all the preparations that are going on in Israel, in the military preparations based on that bill that was passed. And he said very clearly, I'm not saying it's going to happen next week or even next month, but this idea of war with Iran is coming. He goes, because we have no choice. What do you say to the viewer that's out there that's just living their life? They're trying to get their bills paid. They're going to church on Sunday, serving God in their Sunday school class, and living the Christian life, which is good. How How does this connect with them? I mean, really, or even the unbeliever, maybe they have friends and family they're trying to evangelize. How does this connect with the gospel? What's the good news for them? Share that.
Well, it's God's word, prophetic word, finding fulfillment, meaning to me is that it's encouraging because 2,500, 2,600 years ago, even longer, 3,000 years with Psalm 83, these prophecies were written for our time. And God's word is coming to life in front of us, and it gives us the ability to evangelize, because what this means is that we're heading toward the events that are going to lead toward the tribulation, and we won't be here as a church for the tribulation. We could be here for some of these prophecies we're talking about. We could actually be gone before any of these prophecies, because the rapture could happen at any given moment. It's imminent. It's a signless event. But we could be here for some of these events, meaning we can use this information as it's stage setting now and might possibly be here for the fulfillment of it, to evangelize to the lost. We should care about the lost loved ones in our family. Whenever I talk about this, I get a show of hands. How many of you believe if Jesus came today and raptured us out of here, you have loved ones that you know in your family, in your sphere of influence, in your neighborhood, your friends, whatever, that would be left behind and have to go through the perils of the tribulation and on through the rest of the bad things that happen? And every hand goes up. And I say, okay, well, this is why we care about what's going on right now. This is why we need to know about these prophecies. So you can be intelligent when you talk to people about, when they see Damascus get destroyed, you need to be able to say that was predicted by Isaiah around 700 BC. Okay, so what else they should say? What else do you know that the Bible said? And there's so much right now that's alive and about to happen in the Bible for our time. The most amazing generation to be alive. I would have never wanted to be alive any other time than this generation, as long as I know what I know. If I didn't know what I know in the biblical prophecies, I'd be probably panicked and very concerned about where this world's going, because it's not going to get any better in my estimation. And I ask people that question. Do you think things are going to get better? And they say, well, it's going to get worse before it gets better, if it gets better. That's a common response.
We need to take into consideration, again, what we've been talking about, even Jesus' words. I mean, most people have respect for Jesus. And, I like throwing questions out there. When Jesus says to be watching, is he being vague, or is he directing us to be watching about something specific?
Well, the details of the prophecies, especially in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and elsewhere, they're very specific. And when you look at the Ezekiel 38 details, Ezekiel 38 and 39, as a matter of fact, we just did a DVD, you and me, that's online streaming available. We'll have the 3-disc DVD available soon. I'm sure Prophecy Watchers will have that notified to all the viewers. There's every minute detail given in that particular prophecy, Ezekiel 38, who the invaders are, why they're coming, where they're coming from, what's their motive, what will Israel look like when it happens, how will God stop it supernaturally, what will happen in the aftermath. They'll be burying the dead for 7 months, they'll be burning the weapons, converting it to fuel for 7 years. They'll have a professional team, like a hazmat team, going, staking out bodies that weren't buried, the bones could be contaminated. I mean, how much more detail would you want? You could walk away from reading that prophecy, even if you're not an astute scholar, and understand what's being said in that prophecy. So God is not being vague. Christ is not being vague. These prophecies are very specific.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, Jesus calls us to watch and be ready and to be the wise steward, the wise manager, so that day would not overtake us. So, I mean, he didn't just throw it out there to be like, well, it's anybody's guess. No, he was very specific related to all the prophecies of Scripture. And it's great that we have authors and teachers to come along and say, hey, this is the context, this is the background, this is what we're looking for, this is how it connects. And I appreciate as well your humility in saying, hey, this is the way I see it. You're not a prophet, but based on everything that you've studied, this is one possible scenario. And I imagine if something out in the current events comes in a different way, you're going to go, oh, well, let's bring that in over here, and maybe that might modify how we think the scenario is going to go. But the overall framework is 100% certain.
Yeah, it's the timing that gets a little peculiar. But the pre-trib events are pretty clear. In other words, like I said, Israel's not going to be waging a war and fighting off Arabs, fulfilling those prophecies I just rifled off in the tribulation. And so we're seeing the tribulations drawing near. I mean, the cryptocurrencies are out there now, the technologies are available, the global order is coming, et cetera. So we see that over the horizon, the tribulation is just about here. And we as a church, we won't be here for that. We're pre-trib rapture believers. But if that's coming close, I like what Chuck Missler used to say as we kind of close out this program. He said, dealing with these prophecies, you know, when you see the Christmas decorations up at the mall, you know Thanksgiving is just around the corner. In other words, when we see the tribulation is coming in form, getting ready, all the signs are converging for the tribulation, then the pre-tribulation prophecies, they're like Thanksgiving. You know, they're coming before the tribulation. And, you know, these wars are pre-tribulation prophecies. Will we be here as a church? We don't know. Personally, I hope we're gone. I mean, I'm looking for Maranatha to come right now and get us. But we could be here. We could be here to use these prophecies and evangelize to the lost. And these will pique an interest in prophecy. They will increase the appetite in the body of Christ, but also I think in the secular world for biblical prophecy. A time is coming in the tribulation where the people who get left behind, who get saved, the fifth seal saints and their fellow servants and their brethren, throughout the periods of the tribulation, they will cling to every prophetic word that they can get their hands on, because they need to know, they'll know prophecy is valid, and they'll need to know what to do with those prophecies, how to steward their lives to survive through the tribulation. Right now, there's not that much interest in Bible prophecy, but the appetite is going to increase as we start to see these Middle East wars happen.
Yeah, people want answers, and of course, as God's kids, and we have His words that are outside of time, and so we boldly proclaim that Christianity is very unique in that it alone has the ability to predict and to announce the future because of God's word. And so, you know, Bill, always a pleasure. Appreciate you being here with us. And as we continue to watch, you know, as things, you know, maybe they stay calm or maybe they heat up, I look forward to chatting with you again as the circumstances come to be different, or to even to progress or digress, however somebody wants to say it.
Absolutely. This is an important time to be doing these kind of programs.
You know, if you're watching today, again, we appreciate your time, and there's a lot here, and Bill had a lot to contribute to what's going on, and I would just encourage you to continue to put your faith in Jesus, to continue to be watching. There's a lot of solid ministries out there. Here we are, we're trying to be up to date on things, and to bring in the experts to come and to talk, and to provide good biblical insight. We also appreciate your prayers. There's a lot going on here at the ministry. There's a lot of opportunities that we have to continue to get the word out, and as always, to get people to be preparing for the coming of the rapture and to stand before the Lord. That's the exciting part. So we appreciate your time and for this prophecy update, and we will see you next time.